Well, I wrote it really as a business book, but it's got a lot of personal in it and a lot on relationship. And the business book is how to become successful, how to come back from adversity, how to handle adversity. And I think it's something that really people want to read, as you can see by what you're seeing right now.
Trump, The Art of the Comeback, Chapter 2, Rebuilding the Boardwalk, Trump's New Skyline. When people look at my skyscrapers in New York, they often ask me, why even bother with Atlantic City? The fact is, the only people who ask this question are those who have never gone to Atlantic City. They've never seen how massive it is, never seen the millions of people who pour in weekly, never seen the kind of action and excitement you can't find anywhere else. If truth be told, without Atlantic City, it is highly unlikely that Random House would have asked me to write this book, because it was the tremendous cash flows from Atlantic City that allowed me, unlike many other real estate guys, to escape the tough times of the early 1990s. I remember when one of the greatest real estate men of them all, Larry Fisher, the head of Fisher Brothers in New York, read that the Taj Mahal had cost over $1 billion to build. He couldn't understand it. He's a friend of mine, so we called to ask, how the hell could a casino cost this much to build? Larry hadn't been to Atlantic City, and therefore had not seen how the Taj dominates its skyline. I tried to explain what it looked like. He couldn't believe it. He was envisioning a small hotel with a few slot machines and a couple of table games. For that, I would have thought $1 billion in costs would have been nuts too. When I got off the phone, I knew Larry was still in the dark. You really have to see it for yourself to believe it, I told him. A couple of months later, I got a call from Larry. He was in his helicopter, traveling down to Atlantic City. He yelled over the roar of the propellers, I'm circling over the Taj Mahal. Now I understand what you're talking about. I finally get why it cost $1 billion. And I can't believe it didn't cost more. This thing is absolutely amazing. Atlantic City has always been one of the most underappreciated gaming jurisdictions in the world. More people travel to Atlantic City in a year than to any other destination in the United States. Its 12 casinos do more business than the entire Las Vegas Strip. And that includes Caesars Palace, the MGM Grand, the Mirage, Circus, and all the others. These are two facts nobody seems to understand or even believe, except for the people who go to Atlantic City. And it's only going to get bigger. The smart Wall Street analysts agree with me. Some of the others don't. But let's see who is right in the long run. My Atlantic City ventures have been well chronicled in my first 2 books. I'm not going to bore you with the details of the complicated and often tedious meetings that took place in the back rooms of the investment banking houses and law firms. What is interesting to note is that I was able to take my great casino empire, which makes me far and away the number one player in Atlantic City, and bring it through a horrific storm. With the help of Nick Rebus, the president of my casinos, and many others, I was able to survive a terrible time in the financial markets. We ultimately raised $2 billion in 2 separate public offerings, $1.4 billion in debt, $600 million in equity. Much of this money was used to repay old debt, bonds, and various other liabilities I had accumulated. In the end, everybody was happy. My Atlantic City empire is composed of the Trump Taj Mahal, Trump Plaza, and Trump Marina, all of which receive a 4-star rating by the Mobile Travel Guide and 4 diamonds by AAA. What amazes people the most is that in a city where there are 2 major players from Las Vegas and the rest of the country, Taj Mahal is the number 1 casino and Trump Plaza is number 2. A difficult feat. They're near each other and owned by the same company. They compete with each other, yet continue to hold the top 2 spots. The skyline of Atlantic City says Trump, just like the skyline of Manhattan says Trump. A lot of characters show up at our casinos. A wealthy Arab along with a string of beautiful women once landed in Atlantic City in his brand new 747. He immediately went to the Trump Marina and for 4 days on end played simultaneously at two $100 slot machines with a woman on each knee. He gambled millions of dollars over 4 days. Another guest had a proclivity for cars, and after losing millions of dollars, would often ask for appeasing gifts, Rolls Royces, Ferraris, you name it. He was always amply rewarded. Akio Kashiwagi, a Japanese real estate tycoon, was different from both of these men. I had actually met Kashiwagi in Japan at a party I gave for some Japanese friends and investors the night before Mike Tyson's champion fight with Buster Douglas in 1990. When Iron Mike arrived with his entourage, including Don King and his electrified hair, everybody went wild and wanted to have their pictures taken with the champ. I asked Mike if it was all right, and he and I started shooting pictures with some of the guests. As we walked around the room, I spotted Kashiwagi standing in a corner, staring at the wall and talking to no one. I walked over, put my arm around him, and gently shoved Mike into place for the picture. Kashiwagi went completely nuts, screaming, "No picture! No picture!" He put his hands over his face, turned his back on us, and stalked angrily out of the room. Mike and I looked at each other and asked, what the hell was that? Whether it was a coincidence or an act of vengeance, I don't know. But the next day, Kashiwagi boarded a private plane and flew to Trump Plaza in Atlantic City. Earlier in the year, I had had dinner with the late Sir James Goldsmith, the great European tycoon, and he told me about Kashiwagi. Apparently, he was one of the biggest and best gamblers in the world, and he had bet huge amounts of money. Kashiwagi was a strict rules player, and when he played Barakat, he never varied from the odds. In fact, Kashiwagi had recently been down to Sir James Casino in Australia, the Diamond Beach, and had nearly broken the bank when he had won $20 million at the Barakat tables. During this period, I was beginning to feel the economic pinch, and was somewhat reluctant to play a guy who was known to bet $250,000 per hand, every hand. But I couldn't help thinking that it would be pretty spectacular if I won. When Kashiwagi arrived, my people met him at the airport with a limousine and whisked him directly to Trump's Plaza's presidential suite, where he sat for 2 days without moving. When he finally arrived at the casino on Friday night, thousands of chips in the highest denominations were placed in front of him. The stacks, worth $250,000 each, stood over a foot high. The action started immediately, and from the very first hand, Kashiwagi started beating the hell out of us. Within the first half hour, I was down $1 million, and not long after that, I was down $2 million. I thought about my conversation with Sir James. What the hell am I doing? I asked myself. Cash flow is way down, and I'm playing with a guy who could win 40 or 50 million in a matter of days. Barakat is a great game for the gambler because the house has a very little, if any, advantage. In fact, after all the perks that the high rollers get, you could say that the gambler has an advantage over the house. At that moment, I realized for the first time that I had become a gambler, something I never thought I was. In the past, when people asked me if I gambled, I always answered, no, I speculate, because a certain amount of logic and reasoning always went into my decisions. But this had nothing to do with reasoning or logic. I was merely sitting on the sidelines, watching as one of the best gamblers in the world played me for $250,000 per hand, 70 times an hour. Atlantic City forbade 24-hour gambling back then, so Kashiwagi was forced to stop playing early Saturday morning. But after that first day, he earned himself the reputation among my people for being a warrior. He sat at the barricade table for 18 to 20 hours straight without getting up to eat. He didn't even get up to go to the bathroom. He ate rice, but only if he could eat and gamble at the same time. Surrounded by a crowd of his employees, mostly accountants and statisticians, he was stone cold. He showed no emotion whatsoever. I, on the other hand, was down $4 million, and I was not looking forward to Kashiwagi's return. He arrived at 10 a.m. I found myself doing something I'd never done before. I called the pit. I had never once inquired about a specific person. How are we doing, I asked. As it turned out, we were not doing too well. Throughout the next day, Kashiwagi continued to win, until I was down 6 million. I hated myself for allowing this guy to come to play. This was not the time for me to lose millions of dollars. I called the pit again. I was told we were down 7 million, then 7.5, then 8 million, then 8.5 million. I stopped calling for a while. A few hours later I called and we were only down 4 million. Great, I thought. Then I caught myself. How could I be so happy about losing 4 million? I barked at the manager in the pit. How did that happen? We just got lucky, Mr. Trump, he said. Did we have the same dealers? No, sir. We had a group of young women dealing to him this time. The next day, Kashiwagi beat the hell out of me again. We were down 9 million. I asked whether or not the 3 young women were dealing. The pit boss told me no. It was another crew, Mr. Trump. The next day, I called them and things were much better. The 3 women were dealing. They'd whittle his take down to 3 million. Aha, I began to think a pattern. And that pattern repeated itself, day after day, until I told the pit boss, look, I want those women dealing to this guy all the time. He laughed. Oh, Mr. Trump, it doesn't make any difference. It's just a coincidence. I don't give a damn if it's a coincidence or not. I want those women dealing. I picked up the phone and called all 3 of them. I let them know that Donald Trump would appreciate it if they would continue to deal to Kashiwagi for as long as it took. In other words, as long as it took to beat him. The women said they would, but they couldn't start immediately. The next day, the men dealt for the last time, and Kashiwagi cooked me badly. He was up to 9.25 million. I called the casino. Look, this guy's killing me. Times are tough enough. Tell him I'm out 10 million. Tell him I'm out at 10 million. The pit boss barked. He told me it wouldn't be right. Don't tell me what's right or wrong, I barked. I'm out at $10 million, and if we win 10 million, not likely at this point, the game is over. 10 and 10. We're out either way. When Kashiwagi heard my terms, he looked content. After all, he'd be at 10 million. And I mean up 10 million in a matter of hands. What happened next is something of a miracle. My crew, Don Heath, Danuta, Groover, Swan, Trench, Lin, Braden, and Mung Ching, Y dealt. They worked their tails off and beat the crap out of Kashiwagi. The word was out. Huge crowds formed around the Bearcat table as the game got more and more exciting. Then I saw the press. I recognized a reporter from the Wall Street Journal. I was down 9 million. Shit, I thought. I don't need this kind of press. Not at this time. Not now. I figured the game wouldn't last much longer. I asked the pit boss how we were doing. I was astonished by his reply. We're even, Mr. Trump. Even? How the hell did we get even? We had an incredible run of luck. Kashiwagi is beginning to crack. I think we've got him now, Mr. Trump. Over the next 10 hours, we kept winning until, unbelievably enough, Kashiwagi was down 10 million. Remembering our deal, I told my people to stop the play. Enough was enough. Kashiwagi was not particularly happy about this, but he agreed. Gamblers are honorable in their own way, at least about gambling. When a deal is made, they usually abide by it. Kashiwagi went back to Japan. A few days later, an article appeared on the front page of the Wall Street Journal about his status as the world's most flamboyant gambler. It detailed his stay at Trump Plaza. It explained every move he made, where he went, his personal habits. The story was a disaster for a man who shunned publicity. I later discovered that Kashiwagi was a reputed crime figure. That must have been why he didn't want to be photographed with Mike Tyson. After the article, dozens of photographers surrounded his $30 million house in the middle of Tokyo. It was a feeding frenzy. One day he completely lost it. He ran outside to get away from 2 television cameras peering into his window. He tripped over the curb and broke his ankle. His chauffeur pulled him into his black Mercedes and sped off. Kashiwagi went into hiding and was never seen again until his body was found hacked to pieces by a samurai sword. they never caught the killers. It was April of 1990, shortly after Khashoggi's visit to Trump Plaza. I opened the Taj Mahal, increasing Atlantic City's gaming capacity by 20%. With gaming revenues grinding to a halt, this was the worst possible time to bring a new and huge casino online. Acquiring the Taj wasn't something I had planned. By 1987, I bought $96 million worth of resorts, international class B stock for $80 million. Even though this represented only 12% of the company's equity, it gave me 90% of the vote. I had intended to buy the rest of the public stock for $22 a share so I could take the company private, but out of nowhere, Merv Griffin came onto the screen offering $35 per share, nearly a 60% premium over my bid. It turns out that Marv didn't have a clue as to what he was getting into. He described it as an interesting move, but it was a suicide mission. There was no way I wished to top Griffin's bid, and I decided to negotiate. Our compromise, which gave $12 million and the unfinished Taj Mahal, turned out to be one of the best deals I've ever made. Merv's acquisition of Resorts International, an old hotel/casino in Atlantic City, and a resort in the Bahamas, turned out to be the worst deal he ever made. At the time, I thought his chances of making resorts successful were about as good as his chances of getting Sharon Stone pregnant. The funny thing about deals is that you never really know, until some serious time passes, who bested whom. It took most people about 2 years to realize that I'd have gotten the best of Merv, but he gave me a clue that he had been bested. He went all around town bragging about the fact that he'd outfoxed me. When I was going through hard times, Merv gloated over it, not loudly or obviously, but in more of a subtle way. "Isn't it too bad about Donald's troubles?" he'd say with a little smirk to anyone who would listen. Merv is a much different kind of guy than people see. Behind his public persona of a sweet, roly-poly, easygoing person, he really is quite something else. During the Billy Crystal Friars Club roast at the New York Hilton, Buddy Hackett told a story that pretty much sums up my relationship with Marv. He spun an incredible tale as he told it. He'd run into Marv on the boardwalk while he was performing in Atlantic City. Buddy asked him, "What kind of a guy is Donald Trump?" Merv replied, "When Donald was born, he was a Siamese twin with a prick in the middle. In order to separate the twins, a great doctor was brought in. When this famous doctor had completed the operation, he went into the waiting room and announced that both of the twins had died and only the prick was left. But he said he thought he'd use this in his performance. He did. The audience broke up, dying with laughter. I laughed too, except I couldn't help thinking that this was probably the way Merv really viewed me. I'd beaten him badly in business, but believe me, it could have gone either way. Merv couldn't handle it. He couldn't put it behind him. His smug mug even showed up in People's Magazine. The spin, how Merv had beaten Donald Trump at the art of the deal. I couldn't believe it. Considering his new company had assumed $600 million in existing debt and incurred another $325 million in order to buy the old Atlantic City and Caribbean casinos, it didn't seem he had all that much to brag about. After all, he spent almost $1 billion on an asset that was already in deep decline. In fact, in 1989, Resort's projected debt service bill was over $133 million. The company's estimated cash flow for the same year was a mere $28 million. Do the math. 10 months after Merv bought the company, Resort stopped payments on $925 million in bonds. This led to the inevitable bankruptcy. Not long after, Merv took Resorts into Chapter 11. He gave up 77.5% of his equity to the bondholders. In the last quarter of 1993, Resorts lost $44 million. bringing the year's losses to over $100 million. Merv's response? In March of 1994, Resorts filed for bankruptcy protection. Again, I called it, Chapter 22. Now Merv and I are friendly again. He wrote me a beautiful letter of recommendation on a man who is now running Trump Marina and doing a great job. John Bastille. I wish Merv all the best. When I inherited the Taj Mahal in 1987, I inherited a host of existing problems. Taking charge of a half-finished building wasn't the least of them. They'd already dumped $553 million into the project, a very poorly designed structure which, I had insisted, had to be reconceived. Because of the huge amounts of money already wasted, it would have been foolish, although preferable, to start from scratch. It became a matter of figuring out what had to be changed and what had to be left alone. When I do a project by myself, and I am in total control from square one, I always get my projects done on time and under budget. But the Taj was a disaster area, and the opening date had to be postponed, which was the initial reason behind our flat cash flow problems. When we finally opened the Taj in 1990, the economy was terrible. At the time, there was no significant depth in the management of my casinos. When everything was going wrong at once, there wasn't any time for us to get our bearings. We didn't have the luxury of sitting back and figuring out what was wrong, or even what was working. I started groping around trying to find the best people, but it takes time to put in an effectively functioning management team in place, and we didn't have time. Knowing I needed somebody in charge, I began hiring sycophants, so-called geniuses from Harvard and Wharton. All these kids had ever done was analyze ISLM curves in business school. They didn't have a clue. Finally, in January 1991, I installed Nick Rebus as my CEO for casino operations in Atlantic City. Initially, I was reluctant to hire him. Nick had been my lawyer and friend since 1979. I didn't want to lose him as my personal or professional counsel. On the other hand, Nick had a hell of a lot of experience with gambling and gaming in New Jersey. He was one of the first attorneys to specialize in gambling regulatory laws when gambling was legalized in Atlantic City, and I knew I could trust him. Nick strongly believed, as I did, that the key to turning the casinos around was finding the right person for each of these properties. Right off the bat, he did a search, and within a matter of months, we'd hired 3 of the best hands-on casino operators in the industry. With the casinos in good hands for the first time in years, Nick and I could concentrate on our long-time debt. Rather than wait for the axe to fall, we decided to take the casinos through a series of projected, prearranged restructurings. Restructuring bonds is a complete transaction because it involves not only the banks, but also the bondholders and the Casino Control Commission. There are so many people with separate interests that it's hard to get everybody on the same page. Convincing people that a debt reorganization was a good idea was the easy part. A flat-out bankruptcy would have left us with very little chance for recovery. With a liquidation, the worst possible alternative, value drops dramatically and everybody gets hurt. On the other hand, a restructuring could be designed around the core business, giving all the parties the greatest chance for recouping any losses. The real difficulty was getting everybody to agree on the same terms. The Taj Mahal began operating in the middle of an economic situation so bad that almost as soon as the doors opened, the Taj's bonds went down considerably in value, along with virtually every other bond in the country. Carl Icahn, one of the toughest, smartest businessmen in America, became a major buyer by taking advantage of this slide. The bonds were trading at about 30 cents on the dollar. When I needed a vote from the bondholders for approval of the Taj's restructuring, I was informed, much to the dismay of everybody around me, especially the professionals on Wall Street, that Carl's stake in my bonds represented a blocking position. His ownership was so substantial that a negative vote by him would almost certainly blow my ability to make a favorable deal. Carl had broken up many deals over the last few years, And in fact, many of the people he'd heard in business were his friends. The stories of what he'd done to other companies around that time, especially when he had a blocking position, were well known all over Wall Street. George Gillette of Valley and Ben LeBreau of Western Union could both attest to Carl's ruthlessness. But none of this mattered to me. In fact, I felt that Carl's presence as a bondholder might even be a good thing for me. Everybody thought I was crazy. But I know that no matter how tough somebody is, he or she will always remember support you've given or a favor you might have done in the past. You see, in 1988, Carl had asked me if I would be the chairman of a dinner being held in his honor by the Starlight Foundation, a fabulous charity for children founded by the actress Emma Samms. I didn't really know Carl at the time, but I agreed to do it. A few months later, as the dinner date approached, I called Carl and explained to him while it was an honor to be the chairman of his dinner, I would not be able to attend personally. I was in Europe, and that trip would be impossible. Carl was not happy about this. He told me that all his friends and family, most particularly his mother, were counting on seeing me. He was very nice about it, but firm. As chairman, he said, I was morally obligated to attend, and he was right. I really had a dilemma on my hands, because my trip to Europe couldn't be cut short. Finally, I said, Carl, is it really that important to you? Because if it is, I'll definitely be there. So I flew back to the United States right before the dinner, which was a rousing success, and left again for Europe as soon as it was over. 3 years later, this man was my biggest bondholder, and I was not concerned. When the votes were needed, Carl came through in spades. Not only did he vote in favor of my position, but he also helped persuade others, who were not fans of mine at the time, to do the same. The bonds soared, and the bondholders made a great deal of money, including Carl Icahn, who sold his bonds in 1993 for more than twice what he paid for them. At the completion of the deal, I called Carl and thanked him not only for his support, but for his help in getting others to go along with the deal. Boy, he said, are you lucky you came from Europe 3 years ago to be with me at my party. In retrospect, I guess that turned out to be one of my better moves. More importantly, it shows that even the toughest, most hardened businessmen are capable of gratitude. Once all the restructurings at the casinos were complete, my regret interest obligations decreased from $233.7 million to $132.9 million. I had 3 standalone operations with a full complement of managers and executives. Everything was operating much more efficiently, and there was always the chance that we could refinance in the future. Through all of my difficulties, I still had my loyal customers, people who believed in me, and those who loved my casinos because they are just plain better than the rest. The numbers may have been down, but there was still substantial cash flow and tremendous business. I love my customers because they love me. In particular, they showed their support during the bad times. People would reach out to me as I walked through my casinos. Sometimes they'd actually grab me. One time, a sweet little old lady reached out to me and grabbed my hand. Don't worry, Donald, she said. We're going to be with you. It doesn't matter what's happening now. Another time, I was walking through the Taj Mahal, and a lovely-looking woman handed me a lottery slip. Mr. Trump, I love you, and I love your casino, she said. I decided to buy this lottery ticket for you. I asked her how much it would be worth if I hit. She said that payoff was up to nearly $20 million. I took the ticket, gave her a little kiss on the cheek, and handed it back to her. I couldn't help grinning. Darling, I said, you might as well keep this because $20 million is just a drop in the bucket compared to what I really owe. The banks would gobble up this $20 million for breakfast. It wouldn't even matter. After dealing with the banks, I turned my attention to the casinos, which were starting to do their best business ever. The value of my real estate holdings was increasing rapidly, and I was beginning to get the feeling that the tough times were ending. Then came the day when I thought just about everything was fixed. Business was great. So I called the folks at Donaldson, Lufkin, and Jenrette, or DLJ, one of the most dynamic investment banking firms in the country, and said, "Let's go. It's time to go public." At the height of the market we hit, I raised over $2 billion. I actually thought we could have raised much more, but I chose not to. In retrospect, I'm glad I didn't, because my casinos are individually doing very well, much better even than the day I went public. Casino stocks have been hit very hard. Wall Street has been tough on us. I find this somewhat unfair, being grouped with a lot of companies that are fundamentally different. The only thing we have in common is that we run casinos. My company, Trump Hotels and Casino Resorts, is incredibly liquid, with 4 magnificent casinos, including one in Buffington Harbor, Indiana, right outside of Chicago. To a large extent, we've all been the victims of Wall Street. There can be a bit of herd mentality there. Once one analyst starts dumping on an industry, often the others follow. Right now, as I write this chapter, the casino markets have been lousy. They will come back though, and the numbers will speak for themselves. I have tremendous confidence in my public company. Those buildings have not been and will not be duplicated, either in location or form. I have tremendous confidence in the future of Atlantic City and hotels in particular. Time, I believe, will prove me right. Chapter 3 will be called Wall to Wall Plush: How I Got 40 Wall Street. I'm a lifelong New Yorker. Even though I grew up in the outer boroughs of Brooklyn and Queens, Manhattan has always been my real home. Since I did my first Manhattan deal at the Commodore Hotel, the Trump name has been synonymous with Midtown and the East Side. Despite my penchant for Uptown, I have always had a special feeling and desire to control one spectacular property in the downtown financial center on Wall Street. 40 Wall Street is a special building. I've heard people say that it's been overshadowed by the Woolworth Building. Some say it's dwarfed by the World Trade Center. Reality check: neither can compare with this magnificent 1.3 million square foot landmark. Once I set my sights on it, I knew that it would be mine. In 1996, I got it, and at my price, $1 million. Buildings like 40 Wall Street keep me going. I know I'll never get bored. It's 72 stories, including the magnificent tower that scratches the sky. The building has had a long and alluring history as a fabled tower, often described in books and magazines. For a short time, 40 Wall, which was built in 1929, was the tallest building in the world, soon eclipsed by the Chrysler Building, which, in turn, would be outdone by the Empire State Building. To this day, 40 Wall Street is outside of the World Trade Center, the tallest building in downtown Manhattan. It is perhaps the most beautiful building in New York, and its green copper spire is in a class by itself. My relationship with 40 Wall Street began as a young man, the moment I laid my eyes on it. I was mesmerized by its beauty and its splendor. But I didn't become serious about the building until the early 90s, and at that time I was struggling. In the 1960s and 70s, 40 Wall Street was always a fully occupied building. Sprawling law firms and big banks were its primary tenants. It was a hot property. In the early 1980s, however, it was bought by Ferdinand Marcos, who, as you probably remember, lost control of the Philippines in a brutal and bloody war. Marcos also bought 7030 Fifth Avenue, known as the Crown Building, on 57th Street, just across from Trump Tower. Unfortunately, during Marcos' reign over 40 Wall, the building suffered greatly. Frankly, who could blame him? What was he going to focus on? A revolution or his skyscraper? Dealings at 40 Wall became chaotic. It wasn't that the tenants hated the building. Despite its dilapidated state, they loved the location and the views. The problem was that when it came time to renew or extend their leases, It was virtually impossible, due to the lack of management and the nagging legal question as to who, in fact, owned the building. Marcos claimed he owned it, but the people of the Philippines claimed Marcos, who had bought the building with the money stolen from them. Therefore, it was owned by the Philippines. The whole thing was a mess, and Marcos was out. But where there's turmoil, there's opportunity. So half the real estate groups in New York were going after 40 Wall Street. The market was great in the 1980s. Wall Street was hot. There was a virtual bidding frenzy for the building. Jack Resnick and Son, headed by Burton Resnick and his very talented son Scott, ended up buying the building. The Resnicks are a great family, and they descended on 40 Wall Street. The problem was that the real estate market was beginning to go south. The price the Resnicks paid for the leasehold interest, which was between $100 and $135 million, was too high. The long-term lease was defective, and the Resnicks were having problems with Citibank. Through a long, heated, and laborious period of negotiation, it became clear that Resnick and Citibank were not going to make it. Therefore, 40 Wall Street would be back on the block. I wanted to make my move, but in the early 90s, I was in no financial position to do so. The market was terrible, and I was in the midst of straightening out my own finances. That's when I read in the New York Times that a group from Hong Kong, the Kinson Company, was buying 40 Wall Street. The price was substantially lower than what Resnick paid. It wasn't that Resnick overpaid. The world was just a different place. At the time, I knew Kinson would make a great deal, and I envied them for being able to acquire this jewel. Nothing is more exaggerated than the ubiquitous real estate expression, location, location, location. I've seen people without talent take the best locations and destroy them, losing loads of money in the process. I've also witnessed professionals taking terrible locations and having nothing but success. Don't get me wrong, a good location is a wonderful thing, and certainly very important. But if you don't know what you're doing, location alone will not solve your problems. Unfortunately, the folks from Kinson just didn't have a clue. After things settled down and their purchase was complete, I called them and said I'd like to meet. I wanted to discuss a possible partnership. They came to my office, full of vim and vigor. They didn't seem to be looking for a partner. They just went on and on about their plans for the building. They told me they wanted to gut the lower section of the building and create a large atrium, just like Trump Tower, they said. That's a wonderful idea, I replied, but the building wasn't designed for an atrium. The location wasn't appropriate for an atrium. And what will you do with the steel columns that are holding up a 72-story building? They suggested moving the columns, no matter what it would cost. They seemed convinced that the building would be beautiful in the end. Well, to tell you the truth, I almost fell out of my chair. I asked them how their negotiations were going with the owners of the land, the Hindenburgs, a very wealthy German family led by the formidable and highly respected Walter Hindenburg. Walter Jr. and Christian, the Kinson people said that they weren't having too much luck with the Hindenburgs. In fact, preceding doom they were having, admitting they'd be most likely unsuccessful with their renegotiation of the lease, as Citibank and Resnick had told them before. Although it had 63 years to go, the lease was old, and many of the terms were obsolete, making it very difficult to finance. And through the Marcos, Reskins, Citibank, and now the Kinson reign, the Hindenburg family had been unfairly maligned. They had gotten a reputation for being impossible to deal with. I'll get to that in a moment. As the Kinson group was leaving the room, I wished them well and explained to them that they have to be very careful. Construction in New York is very tricky and expensive, and the project they were getting ready to undertake, particularly removing the columns and the underpinnings of a 72-story tower, would be very dangerous, complicated, and pricey. I felt bad for them. It's not that they were stupid or arrogant, they were simply naive. No one tries to take on structural renovations without a great deal of diligence or study. I suggested that the buildings could be magnificent if left alone, but enhanced. Unfortunately, they had their minds set on something much different. When they were gone, I shook my head in amazement. At the time, it seemed like the end of 40 Wall Street. You can imagine my displeasure. Such a great landmark building. Such great possibilities. And these guys who had bought it seemed totally intent on going forward with a plan that would take away the majesty of this landmark building, and spending huge amounts to do so. A number of years went by and the market was not improving. It was indeed getting worse. Despite this slump, I kept hearing word that 40 Wall Street, even in as bad a condition as it was, had many leases ready to be signed. Kinson, as it turned out, was unable to sign them because of its difficulties with the Hindenburg family. It was strange. Apparently, the Kinson people had poured vast amounts of money into the building, but into things you don't see: air conditioning, mechanical systems, and so on. To me, this doesn't make sense. Kinson was represented in the leasing details by Peter Friedman of the Friedman Realty Group, a high-quality Manhattan brokerage firm. The two guys in the deal, Jeffrey Lichtenberg and Andy Sachs, who now work at the Edward S. Gordon Company, told me that at one point they had 36 leases ready to go. The problem was, as they explained, the leases were not just being countersigned by the Hindenburgs. I think the Kinson people had never experienced anything like this. First of all, they weren't real estate guys. They manufacture apparel, primarily sneakers, in Hong Kong. That's no background for dealing with the ins and outs of developing in New York. I knew 40 Wall Street could be a success, but not if the landlord refused to sign leases. As it turns out, not to my surprise, Kinson got a heavy dose of New York. Contractor bills were far more than they should have been. The architect they'd hired, the excellent firm OHOK, was having a grand time coming up with the new and better designs and billing Kinson millions of dollars. The money Kinson was pouring into the building, tens of millions of dollars, was escalating out of control. At the time, I didn't know exactly what was happening. If I had, I probably would have tried to help them. Later on, when I was speaking with some of the contractors on the job, they said, "Donald, we're having a field day with these guys. Everybody was making money except Kinson." Because of my love for this grand building, I'll never forget the day I was in my office at Trump Tower and I received a call from a broker named Peter Nigg. He told me that the Kinson Group wanted to set up a meeting. I immediately knew it was about 40 Wall Street. I knew I'd get it. It was just a matter of time. And now I was going to get it at my price. Kinson had spent vast amounts of money trying to develop it, and quite frankly, they had gotten nowhere. You can't even imagine it. Just the legal problems with the existing tenants would have been difficult to scare anyone off. But throw in the tremendous difficulties with the contractors and suppliers, and basically, they wanted out, and they wanted out fast. I was thrilled. I invited Peter and his group to my office. Remember, this would be our second meeting. The same men who had been so full of enthusiasm just 3 years before were now beaten and depressed by what they had experienced. New York can do that to you. You've got to be tough. You've got to negotiate tough, and you cannot at any time let anybody take advantage of you. The way that people have taken advantage of the Kinson execs. Suddenly, word gets out on the street that you're a pushover, or worse. Whoa, you're fucking history. As bad as things got for me, and they got pretty bad, I will never let anyone push me around. This saved my ass. I always sent out the message: don't lie to me, don't cheat me, because I'll find out, and I'll find you, and it won't be pretty. These poor guys were in over their heads. I greeted them warmly. Welcome to New York. They were not amused. At this point, the market was still bad. It was early 1995, but as the year progressed, I saw signs that things might soon not be so great. My company was starting to boom. I'll tell you what, it was really strange. The Kinson people asked for silence. They said they did not want to go out to the market. They wanted to deal exclusively with me. I didn't understand this. In fact, this had never happened to me before. When a market is rising, I go to as many people as possible to see what kind of price I can get. Kinson had tons of contractor lines on the building. This didn't bother me. This is my world. I knew all the contractors. Some were killers and some were fair, but in every case, they were friends of mine. I had worked with them hundreds of times. So the negotiations begin. What little negotiating there was. I told Kinson I'd pay them $1 million for this magnificent 72-story building. I agreed to assume and negotiate out of their lines. My only caveat, I made the deal subject to my restructuring a new ground lease with the Hindenburg family. They accepted my terms without a complaint. I was stunned. They just wanted to go home. They had lost their shirts. Vast sums of money. Battling in New York real estate. They'd learned a crucial lesson. One I can thankfully say I learned at my father's knee. New York is a minefield, and if you don't know what you're doing, you will get screwed. So we signed the agreement. Literally, as we were leaving my office, I put in a call to Walter Hindenburg. I knew the only reason 40 Wall Street had a bad reputation in the real estate community was that everybody knew the legal terms of the ground lease were choking the building. The good news was that the rent, because the lease was such an old one, was incredibly low. I got Walter on the phone in Germany. Even though we were a 6-hour time change and 300 miles apart, 3,000 miles apart, it was an immediate love fest. Walter is an immensely proud and successful man who hated seeing the stupidity of what was happening to 40 Wall Street. Over the years, he watched as tenants fled the building. Tenants left only because no one knew who owned it, or some naive developers were looking for a quick fix to finishing the building. On the contrary, people like the Kinson folks would spend tens of millions of dollars trying to redevelop a dream that would never be. Not because they were stupid, but because they were impractical. They didn't have the instincts, the touch. As soon as Walter and I spoke, he knew what I had in mind. We worked out a new and modern lease, extending the term from just 63 remaining years to over 200 years. We stabilized the rent, but the terms in the agreement were modernized. Mortgages would be able to lend, and tenants would be able to sign up quickly. The new document was fresh and beautiful. I informed Kinson that we had made our deal with the Hindenburgs, and they were astonished. Now it was their turn to fall off their chairs. They never thought anyone would be able to woo Mr. Hindenburg. What they didn't understand was that the Hindenburgs and their very able real estate representative, Perry Pine, had a correct vision for 40 Wall Street, long before anyone else. During this pre-closing period, I began to renegotiate with some of the contractors who were taking advantage of the Kinson Group. One of them came to my office to discuss a line, a few $1 million, I think. I asked him, "How have you done on this building? Have you made any money?" The answer to this question would normally be, "No, Donald. No, I'm getting killed." This is the only answer, unless the guys are complete idiots. Not this time. The guy looks at me squarely in the eyes and says, "Money, Donald. I've made a fortune on this building. Everybody has." He shrugs. I balk. Don't get me wrong. I appreciated his honesty. But I informed him that I would have to take some of the fortune back. He agreed. In all cases, I settled the lines on for a small fraction of the face amount. And now I have one of the best buildings in New York at practically no cost, even before I closed the deal. In all cases, I settled the lines for a small fraction of the face amount. And now I had one of the best buildings in New York at practically no cost, even before I closed the deal. On top of that, in just a short 3 months, it was evident to all that the market would soon be strong again. I closed the deal with Kinson, and now the owner for at least the next 225 years of 40 Wall Street. Kinson had wanted $5 million for 40 Wall, which was cheap, only about $4 per square foot for the magnificent building. Ordinarily, I would have jumped at the offer, particularly because Kinson and its predecessors had poured millions into the building, all of which I would benefit from. However, I recognized there was an even better deal to be made. For $5 million, Kinson would have delivered the building to me free of lines. My attorney determined that there were about $4.5 million in lines and trade payables against the building, another example of Kinson's total inability to comprehend the operation of New York real estate. I knew that if I paid Kinson $5 million, it would use most of the money to pay off the lines. I couldn't let that happen when I knew I could do a much better job based upon my 20 years of experience dealing with contractors. I restructured the purchase price in a manner that might give Kinson more cash, but would certainly save me millions of dollars. I agreed to pay Kinson $100,000 at closing, with the possibility of payments up to $650,000 more after closing. Kinson was delighted because it did not have to deal with the contractors or worry about the lines might not be released by the closing date. The closing took place on November 30th, 1995. Then I really went to work. Over the next several months, I met with many of the contractors and made them very aware that they were no longer dealing with Kinson, but with me. By the time I had finished the contractors, I had successfully reduced the millions of dollars in outstanding lines. My discussions with the contractors turned out to be even better than expected, as many of them agreed to accept long-term payouts of their substantially reduced claims. All of the contractors agreed to release their lines in the building at the time we agreed to settle the claims, rather than when they were paid in full or got more work. Within a few months of my acquisition of the building, it was virtually line-free for the first time in many, many years. As it turned out, following the closing, I was surprised to learn that Kinson failed to disclose to me other claims against the building. Consequently, I elected to satisfy some of those claims from the post-closing amounts Kinson was originally entitled to. At the end of the day, my purchase price for the building was less than $1 million. That, in and of itself, was an incredible basis upon which to begin my redevelopment of the building. However, as a result of Kinson's intense desire to wash its hands of 40 Wall Street and return to China, I was able to successfully negotiate for peripheral benefits, which eventually resulted in my receiving monies beyond my wildest expectations. For example, at closing, Kinson assigned to me certain pending insurance claims for property damage to the building, which it had little confidence in recovering from its insurers. Following the closing, I settled those insurance claims for $400,000. Kinson also assigned to me its rights to pending tax reduction proceedings involving the years it owned the building. In view of the decline of the real estate market and the decline in the value of 40 Wall Street during that period, I have been advised in my counsel that I may be entitled to a real estate tax refund as much as $10 million, based on the assignment of rights by Kinson to me. Similarly, as a result of Kinson's unwillingness to remain in this country long enough to pursue claims against tenants for rent arrears, Kinson agreed to assign those arrears to me. Not long after the closing, I settled several of those claims for in excess of $350,000. And most important, I expect to make approximately $20 million per year from the rentals. Not bad for a building that cost me less than $1 million. So in 1996, I bought 40 Wall Street, the second tallest building in downtown Manhattan, for just short of $1 million. After $35 million in renovations, a near-bankrupt building is leasing for as much as $33 per foot, the top of the downtown Manhattan market. At almost precisely the moment I began my reign at 40 Wall Street, the market began to improve. It was amazing what was going on. A new tax incentive plan for both residential and commercial construction in downtown Manhattan was formulated by Governor George Pataki and Mayor Rudolph Giuliani. It gave huge incentives to investors, taking old office buildings off the market and converting them to residential use. It also gave wonderful incentives to commercial tenants locating or relocating in the downtown area. It was one of the best and smartest tax incentive programs I have ever witnessed. The results were immediate. Billy Rudin of the Rudin real estate family deserves much of the credit for getting this plan implemented. He had a vision for downtown Manhattan and just wouldn't stop until he made it happen. Every property owner, and indeed the city of New York, owes him a huge amount of gratitude. Billy worked tirelessly to convince the city and state that downtown Manhattan should be given real estate tax incentives for those owners and developers who are able to convert old and obsolete office buildings into residential apartments. Not only did this tax plan take many dead buildings off the market at a time when office space was in a terrible state, but it created a frenzy of development and ultimately will make downtown Manhattan very similar in nature to Midtown. That is, a 24-hour community where you can live, work, dine, and shop without ever having to leave the area. Billy Rudin, Mayor Giuliani, and many others deserve a great deal of credit for creating this miracle, taking shape before our very eyes. Over the years, I have witnessed many tax abatements and tax incentives, some good and some bad, but never have I seen one so beautifully applied and that worked so well. Buildings were taken off the market one by one, as fast as you could count, and the competition for space began to increase geographically. I had a decision to make. 40 Wall Street was a great building and offered a lot of options. Should I change the use from commercial to residential? I decided to go and counter the trend, as I often do. Almost everybody was talking about the older buildings and converting them to residential. But I felt that 40 Wall Street was so good and so well located right across the street from New York Stock Exchange, I would make it the best office building in downtown Manhattan. My reasons for doing so were twofold. First, I really felt the huge incentives given to residential construction. 40 Wall Street would be left virtually by itself as an office building of the highest quality for commercial tenants looking for space. Second, it was so much less expensive to transform an existing office building, a once high-quality office building, into a new high-quality office building than it was to convert an office building into an apartment building. The conversion to office space was going to cost me approximately $60 per square foot. The conversion to apartments would have cost more than twice that amount. Also, in converting to apartments, vast amounts of space would have been lost. Since an apartment house needs a much smaller footprint, while 40 Wall Street has approximately 1.3 million feet as an office building, it would have been about 750,000 feet as an apartment building. Throngs of people fought me on this decision, but not the people in my office. My right-hand man on the project was Abe Walsh, my top real estate guy, who was adamant in his desire to keep 40 Wall Street as an office building. Abe was a hugely instrumental guy in helping me get this deal done in the first place. He's smart and a class act. I feel lucky to have him. My other proponent in this decision was George Ross, one of the most brilliant lawyers in New York. He reminded me that the building had the most outstanding views in the city and was ideal for high-class operations willing to pay big dollars for unique space. George had been crucial in helping make 40 Wall Street the huge success that it is. Perhaps the most pleasurable aspect of 40 Wall Street has happened since its purchase. I decided to call the building the Trump Building at 40 Wall Street, with magnificent bronze lettering atop the new granite facade staring right into the face of Wall Street and directly into the New York Stock Exchange. The lobby has turned out to be a 10, One of my best construction jobs ever. All the other systems in the building, not done either by Resnick, Kinson, or Marcos, were completed by me. But the money spent by others was so enormous that, other than the cosmetics, there wasn't much left for me to spend. I decided to gut the entire building from top to bottom. Now, when tenants look at the floors, they see vast open spaces with unparalleled views. The space is renting quickly. Go down to Wall Street today, and you'll find a crane on every corner. It's beautiful. I hope that everybody who reads this book will be able to visit this majestic area. I believe it to be one of the most romantic settings in New York. And look at the transformation of what was once a proud and great building into an even prouder and greater one. I've had a lot of fun doing it, and the economics added immensely to my enjoyment. Mar-a-Lago, from vision to victory. My love affair with Mar-a-Lago began in 1985. I was vacationing in Palm Beach, Florida, and I actually began to like it down there. During a drive to a dinner party, I asked the chauffeur what was for sale in town that was really good. He looked at me and without a doubt, he said, "Well, the best thing by far is Mar-a-Lago. But I tell you, I guess you wouldn't be talking about that." I asked him what Mar-a-Lago was, and he told me about the great estate and its history. Rather than going directly to the party, I asked him to drive me over there, starting it out from South Ocean Boulevard. I realized that it was not only magnificent, but it looked like a project that could be fun. The following day, I contracted various representatives of the foundation that owned the estate and was given a tour. I immediately knew it had to be mine. The walls, the ceilings, the space itself were greater than anything I'd ever seen. The house had a grandeur I didn't know existed, certainly not in the real world. Its 128 rooms, each more beautiful than the one before, sit on the most important 20 acres of land in Palm Beach, the wealthiest community in the United States. Mar-a-Lago fronts on both the ocean and the lake, as the Intracoastal Waterway is referred to. With close to 110,000 square feet of space, Mar-a-Lago is by far the largest house in Palm Beach, even with new 50,000 footers springing up all the time. More detailed and refined than San Simon, better located than the grand mansions of Newport, Mar-a-Lago has been unrivaled in its beauty and prestige, virtually from the time it was built. My battle for Mar-a-Lago was brutal and endless, a study in determination and patience. At times, the odds seemed almost unbeatable, but I hung in, never thinking about giving up. I knew I was fighting for a unique treasure, one with enormous potential, and very much worth saving. On first sight, Mar-a-Lago was like an old, beat-up, overgrown Rembrandt waiting to be restored. I came across the wreckage, a fairy tale castle built by a kindred spirit. The enigmatic and incredibly savvy Major Merriweather Post. Her haunting past echoed through the halls of the estate, in its sense of the theatrical and the invaluable input of Wall Street wizard E.F. Hutton, her husband. From 1922 to 1927, the Harriers fussed over every detail of the property located between the sea and the lake. 3 boatloads of Dorian stone were shipped from Genoa, Italy. More than 36,000 original Spanish tiles were laid. There are more antique Hispano-Moresque tiles in Mar-a-Lago than in any other building in the world except for the Alcazar in Spain. It was from Mar-a-Lago that Post ruled Palm Beach society. It never occurred to me that I'd be in the business of preserving a great historical monument until I toured the mansion in 1985. I was spellbound by its opulence and detail. I heard the Post Foundation had put it up for sale. I took it upon myself to save it, and I did, despite the odds. The whole thing started as a lark. Then it became a distraction. It gave me something to do other than to play golf on my vacations in Palm Beach. My strategy? I put in a succession of offers. Since there were so few legitimate ones floating around, I felt it was the right time to go low. I got in. Some say I got lucky. And others say I just know how to make good deals. I paid the Post Foundation $8 million for the house and grounds, including $3 million for all the original furnishings, including the china, the crystal, and the goldware. It's hard to believe, but in 1985 that was a record-setting price. Yet everyone was shocked because it seemed so low for Mar-a-Lago. On the Post Foundation sat several members of the Major Meriwether Post family, among them Dina Merrill, Mrs. Post's arrogant and aloof daughter, who was born with her mother's beauty, but not her brains. During my fight to save Mar-a-Lago, Merrill would constantly criticize me and say things behind my back, all of which would get back to me. She should have been the one to save Mar-a-Lago. Mommy had given her the money, and it would have been an easy and popular thing to do. Instead, she lives in a terribly furnished Palm Beach condominium, thinking about her failed acting career and how she can make me look as nouveau as possible. Other members of her family, however, have stepped up to her place. Major Post Dyer, the granddaughter of Major Meriwether Post, has been a great champion of what I've done at Mar-a-Lago. Major has been a great beauty, a champion swimmer, and from what I've been told, one of Post's favorite grandchildren. She has spunk and substance. I'll never forget the day I received this letter from her. Dear Donald, I have just revisited Mar-a-Lago and was blown away with the restorative and imaginative quality of what you have undertaken. Of all the Post family, I love and feel that I am the most intimately identified with this estate. Deanie, priority-wise, is more a sea cloud person. I took my first steps as a baby at Mar-a-Lago almost 70 years ago. I have returned to visit every year, and I resided permanently in the early 70s to manage the household and staff for my ailing grandmother. My grandmother's fate appeared certain. The future of Mar-a-Lago became, for me, a stressful and unsettling question. Little did I suspect there was a big, blue-eyed guardian angel hovering in a holding pattern, just waiting to land and take charge. You have saved Mar-a-Lago, and now, as a club, it will become alive again, and her space has not been compromised by subdivision. In my heart, I feel that you have the integrity and the class to retain the elegance and style of Mar-a-Lago, and so now it is a new exciting chapter for me as well. Mar-a-Lago could have been the mother of all clubs. The conversation and updating have shown considerable taste. I was impressed with the ironworks extending up the short second-story balcony wall and the additional lighting and fixtures in the patio. It almost looks as if they could have made the artisans employed by Mar-a-Lago in the old days. Even the white paint had a reviving effect as it brightens the interiors. The colorful flowers, the manicured lawns and landscaping all serve as a magnificent frame for the masterpiece of Mar-a-Lago. In style, flair, and ambience, you are a modern extension of my grandmother's spirit. She told me many times, Marwie, you are the breath of spring in my life. Now, Donald, Mar-a-Lago can say that to you too. I am so looking forward to visiting the club upon completion. With love and many thanks for your hospitality. Majorie Post Dye, first grandchild and namesake of Major Meriwether Post. I've never seen anything like the contents of Mar-a-Lago. The furniture and fixtures were, in many cases, absolutely superb. Many of it was retained in my restoration. But the things I didn't like, or that were not of the same quality as the rest, I sold at auction. Perhaps the worst room was the Tower Suite. It was designed by Dina Merrill in an Art Deco, if you can believe it, motif. The strong Art Deco feeling didn't go with the Spanish-style house, but the furniture, in actuality, was very expensive and had great resale value. At first I didn't know this. that my brother-in-law, Jim Grau, noticed a large dumpster in the back of the house filling up with furniture. "Donald," he said, "you can sell this furniture. You shouldn't throw it away. It has great value. It was designed by Simon Price." He turned out to be right, and we sold it and the other furniture for hundreds of thousands of dollars at a Christie's auction. In later years, more furniture was sold to make way for the great spa that was being built and the magnificent suites being made out of the so-called servants' quarters. Great collector's pieces have been added to what Mrs. Post already had, and the interiors now are far more beautiful than they were even in Miss Post's heyday. My first thought was that Mar-a-Lago was that it would make an incredible private club. While that may have been my initial thought, and it would have been something great to do, mine is also a world of reality. And I knew that the zoning and local ordinances would never allow such a use. Mar-a-Lago, as impractical as it may sound, had to remain a house, or the far worse fate of the Wreckers Ball would come to pass. The acreage would be subdivided into large-scale mansion lots. This seems to have been the direction in which many potential acquirers were going. I felt I couldn't let this happen. Mar-a-Lago was too great to allow anything to happen to it that would impact the great beauty that architect Joseph Urban and sculptor Franz Barwick had created. There's one thing I do that drives my execs nuts. I buy buildings before I know what I'm going to do with them. It's my instinct, my sense that I know it's going to work out. When I bought Mar-a-Lago, I had no concrete plans for its future, but my financial situation in the early 90s put its potential value into sharper perspective. One thing that's become clear to me in the past few years is that you've got to be flexible and open-minded about your assets. That's part of what having vision is all about, finding creative ways to make the best of both good and bad situations. The neglect that the house and grounds had suffered during the years following Miss Post's deaths had taken its toll. The tennis court was in ruins. The estate was in disrepair. As a matter of fact, the property was known around town as the White Elephant, spectacularly opulent, but impossible to maintain or manage. I knew I had a lot of work to do, but I wanted it. However, unlike other great houses that were sold to military, academics, and sanitation departments, uses that totally destroyed them inside and out, Mar-a-Lago was virtually sealed and maintained under the loving care of Jim Griffin, whose father had managed the grounds before him, so the deterioration of the estate was not devastating. I knew immediately it could be brought back to life. Fortunately, the United States government, which had been given Mar-a-Lago as a bequest from Major E. Meriwether Post to use as the Southern White House, rarely got to use it. Richard Nixon loved the concept of Mar-a-Lago as a place to entertain. He stated to someone during a visit there that he had never seen anything so beautiful, but he had problems to attend to. Watergate. The last thing he had time for was journeying down to Mar-a-Lago to enjoy the sun and fun of Palm Beach. Jimmy Carter, a different kind of a guy, thought that Mar-a-Lago was too expensive for the taxpayers and gave it back to the Post Foundation. That's when I stepped in. I was living happily at Mar-a-Lago with Ivana and the kids, but in actuality, as a house, it was far too big. I didn't realize this until later, when I began developing various sections of the house for a club, such as a spa, tennis courts, a card room. For many years, there were parts of the house I'd never ever seen before. For example, the bomb shelters. In general, large sections of the house remained vacant and unappreciated. It was only in 1990, at the beginning of my financial crisis, that I thought something would have to be done. The banks liked me, and they knew the desperation was not my fault. But when you owe billions of dollars, and then you journey down to Mar-a-Lago on your 727 But when you owe billions of dollars, and then you journey down to Mar-a-Lago on your 727 for weekends, it irks them. I remember sitting in a room full of bankers and trying to work out a very complex situation. In this case, the bankers are friends of mine, and were very good people. But I jokingly and stupidly said, "See, folks, it's Friday. I think I'll go down to Mar-a-Lago for the weekend." Sometimes jokes don't go over so well, and this one was one of those times. I could see the anger in their eyes as they struggled with my situation. I felt I had to do something, and I had to do it fast, so I said to them quickly, "Look, I'm going to go to the subdivision. Subdivide the 77... Fellows, I'm going to subdivide the 17 acres of Mar-a-Lago rather than sell the house." Then I explained, the house has a very little value because it's so big. I'm going to subdivide, save the main house, and build mansions on the grounds. I'll call the project the Mansions at Mar-a-Lago. I'll turn it into a moneymaker. I had immediately recovered from my Fox Pass. I made a great situation out of a potentially hazardous one. I tried to never offend my bankers. This time it worked. They were extremely happy to hear this plan because I showed that I was thinking and working. Given that I owed billions of dollars, breaking Mar-a-Lago into a number of housing lots certainly didn't matter much, but it was the thought that counted. I wasn't taking advantage of them. So I actually did go down with a much different plan in mind, subdividing Mar-a-Lago. But I won't soon forget my first meeting with Palm Beach officialdom Bob Moore, the town building inspector, and Skip Randolph, the attorney for the town, are good and talented men who work very hard to keep the town in sync. I felt that I was entitled to have 14 lots and that I should have no problem getting them. Both Randolph and Moore suggested a much different scenario. They told me to ask for 8 lots, and I asked for 8. Zoning would go through quickly. This immediately went against my instincts, against all the hard-learned principles of zoning. Always ask for more than you really want. Even the politicians want this, so that when they cut you back, everybody is happy. I said to them, if I ask for 8 lots, you will cut me later in the process. They told me, no, 8 lots were already approved for another person who tried to buy the house, but was unavailable to raise the money. Can you believe it? Someone else got 8 lots on just a contract. And I went through years of legal skirmishes with the town of Palm Beach. Much against my better judgment, my attorney went in and asked for 8 lots. And, after a series of meetings, I was told we could get 4 or 5 at the most. I knew it. At least I felt good that I had predicted this would happen. Of course, the town rejected my proposal, even though it would have been a routine approval. Case in point. Take adversary and make it an asset. Remember, I stated that Mar-a-Lago should have been a club, but never in a million years did I think it was possible to get the property rezoned as a club. A club would have been the maximum use for the property, and I knew it. Now was my chance. First, they'd take my constitutional right away for not allowing me to subdivide the land. Why, I thought, would I have to assume such a burden for the benefit of the town of Palm Beach? It was unfair and everybody knew it. I was entitled by law to 14 subdivision lots. I believe that Bob Moore and Skip Randolph were very embarrassed. Ironically, I think the town council sensed it was making the wrong move by fighting me so hard. I couldn't have been more helpful. I asked them whatever information they needed. I gave them whatever information they needed. I changed my plans. It got ridiculous. A number of council members practically apologized for the rejection, knowing, as they must have, that I was going to take them to court. I met with the council shortly after their final vote. Despite the fact that they'd turned me down, it was clear that they wanted to work things out. But it was too late for compromises. My team and I received each step we had taken over the past year and a half just to be sure we had complied with every request that had been made of us. Likewise, we examined the actions of the town council and the Landmarks Preservation Commission, and we found plenty of reasons for suing Palm Beach. We filed a $100 million lawsuit on the grounds that my civil rights had been denied. But there was nothing they could do. The town reacted with great anger, and one of the council members stated that if I did not withdraw my lawsuit, they would not negotiate. I told her that I was sorry, but it was too late, that there was nothing I could do about it. At first, there was no movement in either direction, but ultimately, the town became concerned. The judge handling the case was not extremely supportive of the town's position, and he was making that quite clear. I would go around asking the council members whether or not Palm Beach would be forced to file for bankruptcy protection if I won the judgment. This did not endear me to him, but it did certainly make a point. During the course of the litigation, while I was doing very well, a member of the town council approached me and said that they would give me the 8 subdivision lots. I told them I wasn't interested. I wanted a private club. They came back to me and said that they would give me the 14 lots, the maximum allowed under the law. I told them I wasn't interested. I re-inherited. I wanted a private club. Ultimately, with the help of a new and very talented lawyer, Paul Rampell, and the guidance of 2 enlightened town council members, Hermine Weiner and the late M. William Weinsberg, the town council of Palm Beach approved Mar-a-Lago for use as a private club. They fought me every inch of the way, but right won out. One of the principal reasons that I had such strong support from the people within Palm Beach was that, unlike the other clubs in town, Mar-a-Lago would be open to all races, colors, and creeds. Paul Rampell really pushed this point. The Bath and Tennis Club and the Everglades Club had no Jewish or black members. Mar-a-Lago would be open to all, and this appealed to a large group of supporters. It also sparked a tremendous fight by those who wanted to preserve the existing system, a system that to this day seems archaic. I always knew that the hardest part of making Mar-a-Lago successful as a private club would be getting the approvals. Being admitted to the Wharton School of Finance or Harvard Business School is, in my opinion, far more difficult than staying there. This is the case with Mar-a-Lago. From the moment it was announced that I had won my approvals, people came flocking to the door, wanting to join. I began selling memberships at $25,000 apiece, then $50,000, and now at $75,000. The membership ranks filled up so quickly that even I was astonished. The fight with the Palm Beach Town Council goes on, and I feel strongly that this is because of the discriminatory ways that are prevalent within Palm Beach. But it's now only small battles. The war was won when they gave me my approval for this great private club. This interesting antidote displays a touch of that Palm Beach hypocrisy. During my fight for the private club approvals, I met with 2 of the town fathers, whose names I certainly will not reveal. We gathered one afternoon, the 2 town fathers and their wives. Apparently their wives are traveling to New York together later that afternoon. We discussed the merits of the club, and then I invited them to a party at Mar-a-Lago that night. I told them that there would be close to 1,000 people present among them. I joked, "The most beautiful woman in the world." They looked at their wives sheepishly, and then they looked at me in horror. "Oh no," they each said separately. "We couldn't do that. We wouldn't even think of going to such a party." I thought that would be the last I've heard of them, but no sooner had I arrived at Mar-a-Lago, a mere 10 minutes later, than the 2 gents were on the phone telling me that their wives had left for New York, and they would love to come to the party. Are the girls really going to be that beautiful?" they asked. Mar-a-Lago has fabulous entertainment. During the past 2 seasons, I had Celine Dion, Jackie Mason, Julio Iglesias, Diana Ross, the Beach Boys, Tony Bennett, and many others. I offered the best performers in Florida. In fact, a person who is involved with the Kravis Center said to me once, "Hey Donald, how do you get these great entertainers? It's unbelievable." The fact is, they come because I asked them to come. I have built up friendships with them over the years. I'll say, "Hey Tony, do me a favor, play Mar-a-Lago next month." And you know what? We're old friends. He just says yes and he'll do it. One of the most interesting Mar-a-Lago experience involved the turmoil over Michael Jackson and Lisa Marie Presley. Michael was a friend of mine and a very good guy, but very different. It began in New York when I got a call from him one day saying he would be coming to the city and would like to get together. He often called to say hello when he came to New York. This time I invited him out to La Circa, one of the great restaurants of New York, headed by manager Ciro Macconi. He was very nervous about going into the restaurant. In fact, he said he hadn't been to a restaurant in years. I found this hard to believe, but after we arrived, I could see it was true. This was in the early 90s, at the height of the Michael Jackson madness. And I don't believe I've ever seen a star as hot as Michael was at the time. When Michael, Marla, and I walked into the restaurant, some of the biggest people in the universe were seated, having dinner. These people have seen it all. They are rich, they are spoiled, and they are snooty. I'll never forget as Michael and I sat down. He was in a red military outfit with a large black hat and picked up the menu. It was as if he'd never seen a menu before. And we carefully went over each item. But what was most amazing were the looks on the distinguished faces in the room as they came over to our table practically begging for an autograph. These are people who had probably never asked for anyone's autograph before, and I can guarantee you, it was not easy for them to do. They would always start by saying, "I have a son who is a big fan of yours, Mr. Jackson. Can you give me an autograph?" But I believe it was for them, not their sons. One woman, one of the most socially prominent women in New York, known for her attitude, approached our table trying to look cool, then slightly tripped. She grabbed the table for support and asked in the same breath, "Mr. Jackson, can I have your autograph?" It was amazing to see this woman, whom I'd known for years, so flustered and nervous. Somehow, Michael feels comfortable with me. I asked him how he was doing, and we started talking about his life, including his sex life. I was somewhat surprised. When Michael told me he had a new girlfriend, I congratulated him and asked, "Who is it?" He was very shy and looked down into his napkin, then put the napkin over his face and said, Trump, I don't want to talk about it. I'm so embarrassed." I said, "Come on, Michael. Tell me who your new girlfriend is." When he finally looked up, he said, "It was a girl named Lisa Marie." That was the end of the conversation, and we went on to another topic. A couple weeks later, I got a call from Michael asking if he could come down to Mar-a-Lago with me. I said absolutely, and we flew down in my plane together. Michael had a small group of people with him. We did a lot of talking. On the flight down, he asked if it would be possible for his girlfriend to come over and say hello, and even stay at Mar-a-Lago with him. I said absolutely. I look forward to meeting her. I asked if it was the same girl, Lisa Marie. He said yes, it was, and that she'd be arriving sometime around 8 o'clock, about an hour after we got to the house. When the doorbell rang, the butler answered, and a beautiful girl walked through the door. I don't believe people realize how pretty Lisa Marie Presley really is. She's got the best of Elvis and Priscilla, and I don't think she has ever been recognized for her incredible glow. In any event, Michael came down running down to the living room, greeted her with a hug, and then took off to look at the ocean. When they came back, holding hands and hugging, they seemed very much in love. I'm not saying that I was surprised at this, but there is no doubt in my mind that they had definitely had something going. During the weekend, we saw very little of Michael and Lisa Marie, since they stayed up in the tower. Then, they made the mistake on a Saturday afternoon of trying to sneak out of Mar-a-Lago and go shopping, in disguise on Worth Avenue. Well, the paparazzi found out and all hell broke loose. They were driven in limousine back to Mar-a-Lago with the paparazzi in pursuit. The rest of the weekend was absolutely wild. Hundreds of cameras surrounded Mar-a-Lago as Michael Jackson and Lisa Marie Presley were stationed in their Love Nest tower, rising high above the house. The press didn't bother them, or me either, but it was quite a frenzy. I had other guests at Mar-a-Lago, one of them the brilliant New York businessman Arthur Goldberg. He took a company named Bali, which was in tremendous trouble, By any other account, they would have been bankrupt and defunct. And through sheer talent, energy, and force, built it into a great company in a short time, and sold it to Hilton Hotels for $3 billion. Arthur made over $100 billion on the transaction, and I often cite him as one of the few examples I have seen of a top executive truly deserving what he gets. He did an absolutely incredible job. He is now the president of Hilton Gambling Division and is working closely with Baron Hilton and Steve Ballenbach. In any other event, Arthur and I were having a meeting in one of the rooms at Mar-a-Lago when there was a knock on the door. Arthur didn't know Michael Jackson was staying at the house, but he was aware that there was other guests at the house and was curious to why there's so many people taking pictures. Arthur got up to answer the door. This particular room at Mar-a-Lago, the Dutch room, is done in very dark wood and is lit very dimly. In keeping with the look, Arthur swung open the door, and there was Michael Jackson. Arthur couldn't believe it. Look, it's Michael Jackson," he said to me. Michael, on the other hand, saw somebody he wasn't familiar with, put his hand over his face, and ran down the hallway. This is the last we saw of Michael that weekend. He went back up to the tower to be with Lisa Marie. People often ask me whether or not the relationship was a sham. And I give him an emphatic no. I was there, and the magic of Mar-a-Lago brought it out. Because they left, it didn't work out so well. I can tell you, for at least a period of time, these two folks were really getting it on. I think Mar-a-Lago will transcend me, and I think that much better now than I think I did when it was a private house. Then I was bored. As I said before, vacationing does not do it for me. Now on the weekends, I'm not just screwing around playing golf. I'm creating masterpieces, something people can enjoy for years to come. The next chapter would be called Trump International, 4-Star Living.